Recently, I had a very long conversation with my mother, and she was telling me about going around in her neighborhood in South Central Los Angeles / Leimert Park / Crenshaw District. She was going around talking to men, while vending, because she's a vendor in that area. And she would mention to the men that they are leaders. They are the leaders. Men lead. And I'm here to serve you. But this is something that she shared with me. And this conversation lasted about an hour and a half. But it took me back to how I was raised. Because keep in mind, I was raised by 3 women. My mother, aunt, and my grandmother raised me. And of course, the stats work against most young men raised in that type of environment because you have more estrogen than testosterone. But in the case of my situation, especially from my mother, she made sure that I didn't feel shame for having a penis or being a man. That was her goal. She wanted to make sure that I understood how important it was to aim for being a provider. Okay? These were important to her. She wanted me to hold on to my masculinity. Now, that was not the talk back then because we weren't dealing with what we're dealing with today in the 2000s or in the 2020s. But back in the 80s, which is when I was a kid, she emphasized the importance of being a man and what a man is to do. And I am very, very happy she did this because there is a group of men today here in 2021 who feel useless, who feel unimportant, who do not have a purpose. And a man who does not have a purpose is already dead. There's this idea that men are trash floating around. And this idea is being pumped out there with hashtags. And it's become so dominant that little boys are now finding out about this on social media outlets. And when a young boy feels useless, when a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old feels useless, what do you think that will do when they get older? And so I'm listening to my mother tell me this story, and I'm remembering her teachings when I was a young one. And I feel very, very good. And I recognize how important it is. And I recognize what's going on with her because she's coming to terms with what she needs to do, being in her mid-60s, and how this is a message that needs to be emphasized because it's not going to be enough for men to praise other men and elevate them, which is very important right now. It's very important for men to elevate other men, but it's even more important for the women to do it because that right there is the way that the message will be pushed. Because if the women don't stand up and say, hey, you know what? Not all men are toxic. You know what? Not all men are abusive. Not all men are trash. If there is a large group of women who are willing to stand up and say, you know what? Cut that out. Because our sons are going to be the future builders and architects. And yeah, having careers for the daughters is great. But guess what? The men need to be strong enough to handle the adversities that they were designed to do. They need to be strong enough to face adversity. They need to be strong enough to build, strong enough to do the work, strong enough to lead, as my mother has been telling these men. Yeah. I was raised by 3 women who did not make me feel ashamed for being a man. My grandmother used to say, I can never hate a man. She used to say this all the time. My aunt used to always make sure that I felt good in my manhood, and she would indicate that there's love there, there's an appreciation there, regardless of the choices that they made. Because all three of my mothers, their choices in terms of other men and dealings haven't necessarily been the greatest or have produced the best results, but they didn't take that and dump it on me. They didn't take the choices, the relationship trials, and dump it on me and make me feel like being a man is trash because of the choices that they had to deal with. Okay? Even though they have been through heartbreaks, heartaches, disappointments, they still felt that men are important. We are different, but we need each other. We are complementary. This is what they instilled in me. There are ladies out there who feel the exact same way. They feel this way. However, their voices are the least heard. On social media platforms and media, their voices are the least heard. Now, of course, I'm speaking on a human level right now, because the human experience has produced what has happened up to this point. Because on a metaphysical level, none of this matters. On a spiritual level, none of this matters. It doesn't. But on a human level, oh yeah, this is the narrative. And these movements that have been designed to create an imbalance have flooded into the minds of people. We already know the downside of the interactions between men and women. We know what that is because it's been talked about so much, especially within the last maybe 4 or 5 years, maybe 6. The conversation has been emphasized, and the conversation is needed, right? We already know what the downside is, but there's very little talk about the upside. There is very little talk about when the dynamics between men and women actually work. There's very little talk about the men who did things right before the 2000s, before social media, before hashtags. And there are men who do the right things. There are men who know how to articulate their thoughts. There are men who know how to lead their families, who make great decisions, who do not abuse their families, who are not acting out of tune. That should be mentioned. There has to be a balance. You can't tip more one way than the other. Keep in mind that a man has to work very, very hard for every single thing that he gets, whether he is attractive or not. He has to do the work. He has to do the work. He has to be strong enough to do it, smart enough to do it. That's the bottom line. This world can be very, very challenging for a man, and he is built and designed to deal with it. But when he has no purpose, that's a problem. There are men who know how to approach the right way. There are men who do this. Not all men are trash. So men, for those of you that do the right things, I applaud you. And you keep doing the right things. And don't let anything that's going on right now deter you or derail you from continuing on your journey. Like my mother used to tell me when I was a young boy, stay focused and keep up the good work.